Well, welcome to the Greater West Bloomfield Historical Society presentation today, March of 2022, and time's flown by with COVID. So we're happy to meet together with an exciting topic. And before we get started, let me admit a couple more people here. Where'd they go? I'd like to share with you a little bit about the Historical Society. So you'll see that we enhance communities by preserving and sharing our history in Keego Harbor, Orchard Lake, Sylvan Lake, and West Bloomfield. For 48 years, we've been servicing the public with about 39 contacts with museum open houses, programs, student visits, and tours. Apple Island is listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and we have about 50 historical markers in our communities, and we're appreciated by people in our communities. Okay. The Orchard Lake Museum is at Long Lake and Orchard Lake Roads, overlooking the lake. This place reflects our community's history. It was a path for Native people, I saw on a map this week, a stagecoach tavern for travelers. Later, it was a Orchard Lake Hotel for vacationers, Orchard Lake City Hall for residents, and a museum for the public since 1987. The renovated museum opened in 2021 with celebrations and recognition. The new museum indoor exhibits were all new. They're in chronological order, highlighting our past with more activities, artifacts, information, and time periods included. All new museum outdoor exhibit panels are in place, with a new exhibit and the 10 panels highlighting our history. We increased our hours to the first, second, fourth, fifth Sundays and third Fridays from 1 to 4 p.m. Standard open houses include Anishinaabe craft and activities. Different themes are presented on the second Sunday open houses. And those are all photos taken recently. We have a gift shop at the museum, pickups available at Orchard Lake City Hall. Some purchases are available at the City of Orchard Lake, the St. Mary's Library, and West Bloomfield Town Hall. We have monthly and Apple Island programs. There's our April programs. You'll see the Epiphany Glass Tour on Thursday, April 21st, and then the Orchard Lake Nature Sanctuary Walk in the spring, April 24th from 2 to 3 p.m. And that information is on our website. Our Apple Island tours for 2022 are on hold since West Bloomfield School District ordered 2 new pontoon boats, postponing the second grade tours and the public tours. We'll post online and share with you when we get that organized. In the meantime, in between time, we always participate in community events, activities, and groups. The Michigan Week Breakfast is coming up, and it'll be celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. There's their updated logo. Memorial Day parades, community events, community exhibits of all kinds. We have partners and sponsors in 2022, and we appreciate their support. Certainly the community partners of the City of Orchard Lake, West Bloomfield Library, West Bloomfield Parks and Township, our museum exhibit sponsor, Glenn King, our newsletter sponsor, Mindell Realty, our program sponsors, Gino's Pizzeria and Petite Gardens, and then West Bloomfield Activities Guide sponsor for winter and spring's been Sunrise of Bloomfield, and our website sponsor, Town Hall Place of West Bloomfield, right down the street from us.
Did you like the way that haddock tastes?
So also please support GWBHS while you shop.
Wait, are you talking to me?
See our website for details.
I only had a tea.
Smile and Kroger,
More
and
salt.
Luca, and photos by Hat. Whoops. Become a member, a volunteer, a sponsor, or a supporter. Enhance our communities by preserving and sharing history. Thank you. And there's our website listed, and appreciate your attention to that. So if you're all on mute, then Katie will be able to give her presentation now. Let me just check that. I think we're good. Okay. All right, Katie. Well, as a way of introduction, Katie might be new to you or not. She's not new to me. She's been with the Historical Society for a while. She's been a president or vice president back 2010 or 7 or 8, about in there. Since then, she's finished college, gone on and got a PhD, and had a life in the academic world at Notre Dame, and now is the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan executive director, which is pretty interesting activities. But the way she gets to us today is by her association with Apple Island. Her family's, she's a descendant of the Campbells, who were some of the last residents there. And so she's got a wealth of information, and I'm going to let her tell you more. This topic's been of interest to us as an organization for years, because as we go to talk about our story, we see legends pop up and wonder about them. You know, is this a true story? And what's a story? And how true is it? And where to come from. So we've been interested in this for years, and for Katie to give us this presentation today is wonderful. She's agreed that our Zoom recording will be allowing us to post it online, which we will at YouTube sometime this summer. Our staff person who handles that's no longer with us, and we'll need to hire somebody new. And I've learned a lot of tech things, but that's beyond me at this point in time. So we'll get that up later this summer. So you can look forward to seeing it again and sharing it with folks that you know might like to see it. So with that, I will let Katie tell us more about all the above.
Let's try that one more time. There we go. Okay, hello, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I can't believe it. I think I have been involved with GWBHS for 20 years. So it is lovely to be back. And a special shout out to the JHSM people in the audience. Rick Coleman, I saw you were on. We're going to be talking about the 7 Years' War, which I know is one of your favorite subjects. So stay tuned for that. So we're going to talk today about some local mythology I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with, even if you don't realize that you are. So I thought I would begin with a little audience participation. Don't worry, this will not be painful at all. Feel free to type these answers in the chat if you don't wish to unmute yourself. But if I were to say to you, what did local native peoples call Apple Island? You would say, any answers? I know some of you know it. Well, one of the things you might say is this, Me-nah-sa-gor-ning. And if I were to ask you what famous Odawa leader is buried on Apple Island, you might say Chief Pontiac. And if I were to ask you what was he buried with, you would answer a silver cross. Well, this is exactly what I was hoping that you would say. It's also, sorry to break it to you, wrong. we have fallen victim to one of the great advertising schemes of the 19th century, and we're going to talk about that today. But first, if you haven't come across Apple Island before, this is the 37-ish acre island that sits in the middle of Orchard Lake in Oakland County. It was formed during the last ice age, about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Area native peoples began inhabiting it at least 2,000 years ago and maybe even 10,000 years ago. And the reason for this is that it sits at the confluence of three watersheds, the Huron, Rouge, and Clinton rivers. You can see that convergence in the pink box. So if you were going to rendezvous somewhere in what's now Oakland County in the canoe era, this was an easy and well-known meeting spot. As an island, it was defensible, probably had religious significance, as islands did and do, particularly for the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy made up of the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi tribes. The Anishinaabe practiced what ethnogeographers call seasonal transhumance, which is a fancy way of saying they moved around a lot over the course of the year. So those in the area would have used Apple Island regularly during their seasonal migrations. And this was more or less how things remained until 1807. In 1807, the Anishinaabe and the Hurons signed the Treaty of Detroit, ceding their claims to millions of acres in southeastern Michigan, northwestern Ohio, to the federal government. And the tribes continued to have hunting and fishing rights, and they could pass through, but except for a few small reservations, they could no longer claim ownership of their homelands. The Treaty of Detroit is important for our purposes because it opened Apple Island up for surveying and ownership. Those processes were slowed by the War of 1812, so the first survey only occurred in 1817, and that survey crew skipped over the island. So it took a second survey in 1824 to get it on the map, as it were. With the cross-country backlog of formerly native lands needing to be processed before they could be auctioned, it was another 3 years before the island came on the market. So its first owner was a New Yorker by the name of James Galloway, and he bought it in 1827. When white settlers began to colonize Apple Island, they found themselves surrounded by evidence of native presence. Sometimes that meant living, breathing people. Tina Campbell, who you see pictured here, who was a daughter of Apple Island's fourth owner, recalled, quote, "Mrs. Burns, one of the real pioneers, told my mother that she had seen the Indians, 300 strong, pass by her house to the point by Cedar Island, and then swimming a little and fording most of the way, passed to Apple Island, where they held their councils and their feasts. Year after year, they passed her house on their annual pilgrimage to the island. And each year, they were fewer in number until only 2 appeared. The next year, there were none." And sometimes evidence of native presence was in things left behind. Tina Campbell recounted that the island's third owner, John Coates, sold to her father in 1856, had supposedly, he took with him a fine collection of Indian relics, which are still, I have heard, in the museum in Paisley, Scotland. It's certainly plausible Coates's older brother, Sir Peter Coates, was the founding donor of the Paisley Museum, which opened in 1871. According to Campbell, among the artifacts purportedly removed by John Coates was quite a large silver cross, which was taken supposedly from the grave of a chief. So pointedly, that cross was not connected to any particular individual. That would come later. But what was of more interest to her was what the cross symbolized. Quote, "This shows that the Jesuit missionaries had visited our Indians." Other objects turned up. Tina Campbell recalled about 1885, the caretaker on the island was plowing and pierced a small mound. Here was seated a skeleton with a pewter pan in his lap, this pan filled with wampum. The pan is now in Cranbrook's collections, and you see it there. He also recalled, quote, "In several places on the higher land are circular hollows, which were filled with shelled corn and all covered with bark to keep out the rain. This corn was still in the hollows when my father bought the island in 1856. Tina Campbell's nephew, Colin Campbell Jr., even unearthed a complete birch bark canoe from a beach on the island in good enough condition for him to paddle around in. It too is in Cranbrook's collections. Sometimes evidence came in the form of unusual geographical features that defied easy natural explanation. and so they were imbued with human significance. In the densely wooded end known as the Western Woods were what locals called Indian graves, usually mounded terrain. Recent analysis has confirmed that the mounds were created by windborne erosion and they contain no human remains. But Tina Campbell and her contemporaries believed otherwise, and they spun legends to support their beliefs. She recalled, "My heart was greatly touched by a story my mother told me of a little grave with a white heart-shaped stone laid on it. The stone had been placed by a young Native woman who had lost her true love. As Tina Campbell put it, my mother impressed me more than she realized, perhaps by her touching picture of the young woman's grief. I could really shed tears there, and I put my sweetest flowers upon that grave." But the most vivid evidence for Native inhabitation concerned a particular historical figure, and it's the one you referenced at the beginning, Pontiac. The real Pontiac was probably born along the Detroit River around 1720. By 1730, he lived close to the French fort at Detroit. He had only ever known a world with French colonists in it, and he spent his life negotiating with them, fighting for them, fighting their enemies, and trying to orchestrate their return to power after their defeat by the British in the 7 Years' War. Life with French colonizers had not been ideal, but the Anishinaabe retained a considerable degree of autonomy under the French regime, both because the French were not powerful enough to overtake them, and because the French model of colonization depended upon cooperation. But life under the British regime, which began in 1760, was significantly worse. Knowing that Native peoples had no alternative but to accept their terms, the British did away with most of the diplomatic strategies and customs the French had employed, including gift giving and limited recognition of Native power. So in response to those developments, in response to that turnover, Pontiac urged his Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Huron supporters to join him in driving out the British by laying siege to Fort Detroit in May 1763. And he hoped that this show of Native force against France's sworn enemy would catalyze the French to return to power. Well, despite what Apple Island residents would maintain a century later, we know that the first half of the planning of the siege occurred on April 27th along the Ecorse River, about 10 miles west of the fort in what is today Lincoln Park. The location of this intertribal council was strategic and sensible. It was a heavily forested area. It was removed from white settlement, but within easy reach of the fort. It was a place that Native peoples knew well. These were hunting, fishing, and bark harvesting grounds. So this locale makes sense. Several hundred Native people gathered to plan the attack. And so this source also shows you at the bottom there in bold that the French knew something was going on when this planning occurred. So following April 27th, Pontiac held a second council on May 5th, this time at the Potawatomi village just west of the fort, and I've marked it on this map here for you. And 4 days later, the siege began. For more than 5 months, it was successful. The British military was kept locked inside the garrison. In July 1763, Pontiac's forces defeated the British reinforcements who had arrived to try to break the siege in a battle known as Bloody Run. But still the siege wore on as Pontiac waited in vain for French aid. Finally, resigned to the fact that it was not coming, he and his allies moved out on October 31st. But the fight was not over. Pontiac spent the next 3 years moving around the Great Lakes, trying to rally supporters. He left Detroit for the Maumee River in present-day Toledo, where he spent the winter of 1763. He then headed west to Cahokia in the Illinois country, arriving in March 1764. And he stayed in Illinois through April. By July, he was back in Toledo. And in the 5 years that followed, he moved between New York, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. And as you can see on the map here, he turns up most frequently in Southwest Illinois. He signed a peace treaty with the British government at Oswego in 1766, and then he turned his efforts to fur trading. While he was visiting Cahokia in April 1769, he was murdered, and he was probably buried across the Mississippi River in St. Louis. So from this brief sketch, you would be forgiven for thinking that Pontiac would go on to be associated primarily with Illinois, St. Louis, or even Detroit. But from the mid-19th century, perhaps earlier, Pontiac has been associated most visibly with Apple Island. The community story goes like this. Pontiac planned his siege from Apple Island. Well, we can be confident now he didn't. Or the story goes, he retired to Apple Island after the siege before going to Cahokia in 1769. Well, one look at this map will show you he was a man on the move. He did not retire. But he probably didn't go to Apple Island immediately after the siege because there wouldn't have been much time. He had to get to Toledo to camp for the winter, and there was snow on the ground in Detroit by November 2nd of that year. Well, perhaps Pontiac visited Apple Island during his seasonal migrations. Possible. There's no quick and easy route between Orchard Lake and Detroit in this era. In those days, the best way to move was by water. And that goes double if you want to move a bunch of people and a bunch of stuff. So there were two ways that he could have done it: to portage, to carry your canoe from Orchard Lake to the Rouge River. You see this on the left side of the screen, and then wind all the way down the Rouge to the Detroit River, where Zug Island is now. Or the other way to do it is to portage from Orchard Lake to the Clinton River. Take the Clinton, zigzagging north and south all the way to Lake St. Clair, and then down the Detroit River to the fort. Either way, it would have been a long and slow journey to a place that was not a convenient or obvious stopping point between Toledo and Illinois. It was also possible to move overland. So here is a partial reconstruction of the native-made footpaths between Detroit, which you see on the lower right there, and Orchard Lake, which is in the blue box. So note that the entire perimeter of Orchard Lake constituted single-track trails about 18 inches wide. And those origins are preserved in our street names today: Old Orchard Trail, Indian Trail, Pontiac Trail. The surveyors who worked closer to Detroit were less fastidious about marking these trails on their maps. So the information we have about these trails stops because the surveyors didn't record it. But if you can see these lines that I've got up on the map here for you now, you can more or less fill in what's missing. So again, it's possible Pontiac visited Apple Island, and he certainly could have traveled by trail. But it's probably more likely that the association between Pontiac and Apple Island developed after 1818, when Oakland County's seat was established and named Pontiac. I have never come across an explanation for how or why the Detroit and Macomb land speculators who founded the town chose the name, but I can offer a hypothesis. Pontiac, the town, was established in 1818, a year after the survey that opened Oakland County to white settlement, and 11 years after the Treaty of Detroit. So this area was, in imagination and in truth, Indian country. Pontiac, the town, was sited at the intersection of the Clinton River and the Saginaw Trail, a native footpath that ran from Detroit up to Saginaw. That's 100 miles of trail in Indian country. Because Americans were always more about land than water, think about Pontiac's location in the interior of Southeast Michigan, the speculators' idea was to turn that old trail into a military-grade turnpike, linking these two white towns together, a testament to the government's strength, proximity, and control. So what better tragic hero to epitomize that changeover and also to stick it to the British, their common enemy, than Pontiac the man? Of course, naming a town after a vanquished native opponent was not unique to Pontiac, Michigan. And we might point out there are cities and features all over North America named after Pontiac. But some other Michigan-centric examples leap to mind. Tecumseh, named for the Shawnee leader Tecumseh and founded in 1824. Hamilton, Michigan, was renamed Okemos in 1859 for the Ojibwa chief of that name who had died the year before. So those land speculators probably named Pontiac Pontiac, less because the man might have been in that particular geographical area, and more because Pontiac, the town, was a spin-off settlement from Detroit. They were cutting the road over that old trail, staking a claim for the US with every mile. In time, it came not to matter that Pontiac the man probably had no geographical ties to Pontiac the town. The name was the thing. And in time, the mythology to shore up the connection sprang up. 5 miles to the west, Apple Island settlers were doing the same thing. Even today, there's an unusual little round hill on the island's southern shore. White residents termed it Pontiacs Mound. We now know this is a natural feature, and originally white settlers thought it was too. They considered it Pontiac's favorite resting place, a spot most sacred to the tribe, where members held their councils and feasts, and where Pontiac, very much alive, presided. Might even have been on that very spot, in Tynan Campbell's words, where Pontiac planned his famous conspiracy. And the word conspiracy here is revealing, because she was likely invoking historian Francis Parkman's very famous book, The History of the Conspiracy of Pontiac, which was first published in 1851. As one present-day historian has noted, the conspiracy angle never really seems to work, but the idea was compelling to Parkman and to his readers. Parkman paints Pontiac as a noble savage archetype, a preeminently endowed great chief with a haughty demeanor doomed to failure. And contemporary white Americans ate up this stuff, which produced in them a range of conflicting emotions. They cheered on Parkman's Pontiac, even as he fought their mutual enemy, the British. They were both drawn to and repelled by his savagery. And when he died and his cause fell apart, they wept. As Tynan Campbell put it, it is strange how little we really know about Pontiac. And yet, by passing lightly by him and his people, we miss many. I'm going to pause here for a moment because this is where Tynan Campbell takes a hard left turn. Okay, we might fill in the blank here and say we miss many facts, or we miss many opportunities to learn, or something. But what she actually had to say was that we miss many romances. Not what you were expecting, right? Me neither. She doesn't mean romances in the sense of love stories, although that's in there. She's talking about Gothic romances, the fiction genre. Jane Eyre, Frankenstein, Edgar Allan Poe. Dark, atmospheric mysteries, supernatural elements, often involving damsels in distress and architectural ruins. See where this is going? Well, 2 years before Tynan Campbell was born, in 1858, Michigan Supreme Court Justice Joseph Tarr Copeland built Copeland's Castle, a turreted Romanesque revival mansion still standing on Orchard Lake's northeast shore today. It was meant to be his retirement home, but the Civil War's outbreak called him to military duty instead. At the war's end, he returned to his castle, keen to capitalize on Oakland County's booming forest trade. Working with a group of investors, he enlarged and transformed his house into the Orchard Lake Hotel, and it opened for business in 1872. But a year later came the devastating panic of 1873, which decimated tourism. In trying to make good on his investors' gamble, Copeland had a vested interest in augmenting Orchard Lake into a vacation destination. Indian lore, no doubt, factored into that project. He even arranged for a local steamboat, the Pride of the Lake, to ferry hotel guests between the shore and Apple Island, where they could meet Tynan Campbell and her family and swallow a whopping dose of tall tales and alleged sights. And you can see the steamboat circled in red on the right side of the postcard. Well, at the same time, a local physician by the name of Samuel Mott Leggett became a fixture at Orchard Lake. He had arrived from New York in 1852. He spent the next 3 decades moving between his homes in Pontiac and Commerce. He became enamored with Apple Island and its native lore. And he took the best bits of community stories and hearsay, you will recognize them, scrambled them, added a heavy dose of lunacy, and turned it all into this 30-stanza poem called The Legend of Orchard Lake. And it goes like this. Once upon a time, a young native leader who lived on Apple Island fell ill and died. His fiancée was so devastated, she suffered a complete mental breakdown. For her own protection, the tribe confined her. At every opportunity, she would break free of her wardens to retrieve her fiancé's body from its burial place on the high ground of Orchard Lake's north shore, and then transport it back to his former home on Apple Island. Weary of this gruesome ritual, the tribe devised confinement for her of another kind, marriage to another man. When she refused to wed the chosen groom, the tribe executed her. The Creator was so offended by her murder that in a terrible stroke of vengeance, he destroyed the entire tribe, thereby completely exonerating settler colonialism from genocide. Well, if you thought that was crazy, now things take a Gothic turn. To right the terrible injustice done to the murdered woman, the Creator decreed that as long as water flowed, her spirit would possess all power over the corpses of her tribesmen. On any given foggy night, she might resume her earthly form, and by beating a drum, compel them to rise up from their graves and assemble at the site of a canoe partially buried in the sand. After uncovering the vessel, the zombie men would help her carry out her endless ritual, bringing her fiance's body back from the shore to the island and back again. Leggett's fanciful poem first appeared in print in a history book, Samuel Durant's 1877 History of Oakland County, Michigan. Well, he went on to publish it as a standalone piece in 1878, and it was later renamed Me-nah-sa-gor-ning, which is the name that you came up with at the beginning of our conversation, the name that Leggett touted as the native name for Apple Island. He translated it as Apple Place. His poem was then republished in 1909, more than 25 years after his death in 1883 from A Softening of the Brain. These two printings, 31 years apart, testify to the enduring popularity of Leggett's poem, but its renaming is also significant. By the early 20th century, locals recognized and repeated Me-nah-sa-gor-ning's melodic syllables, and they knew to what they supposedly referred. So much so that some of you know them today too. We'll come back to that piece of it in a minute. But before it was published, Leggett's poem circulated privately, and he became a local celebrity. In 1874, right after the Panic of 1873 that put the Orchard Lake Hotel in a financial tailspin, Leggett served as the celebrity starter of the Orchard Lake Regatta. Here is what Apple Island's fifth owner, Willis Ward, recalled. Much interest was excited in a regatta at Orchard Lake. Some Pontiac young men had formed a boat club and built a boathouse over the water in front of the resort hotel on the Copeland property. You can see the boathouse circled in red on the left. The starter was Dr. Samuel Leggett, author of Me-nah-sa-gor-ning. With snow white hair and a full beard, top hat and frock coat, he was an imposing figure. He and the judges and ladies and gentlemen were gathered on a balcony at the lake end of the second story of the boathouse. In stentorian tones, with a whirl of his raised arm, he roared forth, "Are you ready?" Again, he repeated, "Are you ready?" Then finally, bringing his fist down sharply on the railing of the balcony, he roared, "Go!" And they were off. The legend of Orchard Lake, like the regatta, was created to revive tourism for the hotel and the community. It was an advertising scheme designed to put Orchard Lake as a bastion of distinctly American sophistication, history, and romance on the map. Leggett, Copeland, and their investors and supporters achieved it by appropriating the lake's native history, repackaging it into an eerie morality tale, and selling it to their paying customers. And their strategy worked. Their fiction has become a cherished origin story. But how accurate is this purported name? Well, modern-day linguists and historians have hypothesized that Me-nah-sa-gor-ning is an English mangling of a phrase in Anishinaabe-Moin, which is the Algonquian language spoken by the Anishinaabe. What does the phrase mean? Well, it doesn't mean apple. The word for apples is mishimenag. Apples would be a surprising fruit for the Anishinaabe to name the island after, because they are a colonial fruit. They originated in Central Asia. They were introduced to North America by Europeans. And as the Anishinaabe name for Apple Island certainly would have predated contact with Europeans or their produce, it seems unlikely that it would have been related to Eurasian apples. But hawthorn berries, or haws, or thorn apples, as they're also known, are a fruit indigenous to North America. Historian Charles Martinez noted that almost 24 varieties were cataloged in Oakland County in 1945, and one was growing on Apple Island in 1973. The Anishinaabe-Moin word for thorn apples is minensag, which is similar to the first part of Leggett's title, minensag. And the second part might be an approximation of akamig, which means land or ground, or it could be agaming, which means across the lake. So there may be some truth in the mangled name and its translation, but it probably doesn't have anything to do with apples as we know them. But eventually, there were Eurasian apple trees on Apple Island. And we know this because Tina Campbell recorded that the last of them blew down in the tornado of 1877, the same year that Leggett first published his poem. Who might have planted them? Well, the historical record indicates they were there before James Galloway bought the island in 1827. It's possible a French missionary traveling with a tribe might have planted them. Also possible the Anishinaabe did. Some tribes, like the Iroquois, were known for cultivating colonial fruits even before the colonizers themselves arrived. But the Anishinaabe are not known for having done that. And fruit trees require some tending, meaning they aren't conducive to seasonal transhumance. If you're moving around a lot, it's hard to tend an orchard. But early settlers certainly believed that the Anishinaabe had planted them, and that idea has persisted. By the time Leggett knew of the apple trees, they were, in his words, old and gnarled remnants of an orchard planted so long ago that the Indians have no data concerning it. He was not the only one enamored with them. Plenty of locals saw Apple Island as the North American counterpart to England's Avalon, the mythical island of apple trees that appears in Arthurian legend. Avalon was the site both where the sword Excalibur was forged and also where King Arthur died from his battle wounds. So both islands then were mythologized as places of respite, final burial places for legendary figures, and supernatural events. The association of these two islands in locals' imaginations undoubtedly was helped along by the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which was a collective of British artists and poets who infused their compositions with Arthurian legends. So I'm going to give you a quick sample of some of the more famous paintings done by the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And this is the first one, Dante Gabriel Rossetti's King Arthur's Tomb. Note the apples that are above Arthur's sarcophagus. We also might look to James Archer's The Death of King Arthur, painted in 1860. Again, note the apples above Arthur's head. Or Edward Coley Burne-Jones's The Last Sleep of Arthur on enormous painting, took many years to finish it. But the point is that each of these paintings kept Arthurian subjects and Avalon tropes firmly fixed in the public's imagination. The first person to compare Avalon and Apple Island, at least in print, was Stephen Bromley McCracken, who was editor of the Pontiac Gazette. In 1886, he published his own miserably rhymed poem called Avalon, whose purpose was to make the similarity explicit. He cast the two islands as a betrothed couple on its wedding day. Note the lines I've put for you in red at the very end there. Ring out the glad peals, make way and give room. Strew flowers, deck altars for the bride and the groom. This day shall be wed by the dawn of the morning, the Isles of Avalon and Me-nah-sa-gor-ning. Well, the marriage was an arranged one, meant to civilize rude Me-nah-sa-gor-ning through Avalon's gentle and refined influence. In the note which accompanied his poem, McCracken observed the happy correspondence of the two myths, but recoiled in disgust at the thought of the occasional nocturnal resurrections of a dead body pervading the Orchard Lake version. So to overcome his revulsion, he cast Leggett's story metaphorically. The mad woman becomes the personification of both twilight and dawn. Her dead lover, the sun. The tribe, the stars. In so doing, McCracken renders Me-nah-sa-gor-ning sublime and pure as the sun, washed clean, as he wrote, by the on-moving failings of the Aryan tide. A rude native narrative improved and civilized by contact with whites. It was exactly what 19th century Euro-Americans wanted to believe had occurred with colonization and manifest destiny. Except that McCracken and Leggett's poems were not remotely native. Although Leggett claimed that his convoluted plot was founded upon an incident occurring at Orchard Lake long before the coming of the white man, its odd mixture of Gothic romance, noble savage tropes, and the tribe's divinely sanctioned destruction were all preoccupations of mid-19th century white Americans living through and encouraging Indian removal. As white Americans followed current events of Native peoples being forcibly relocated west, and as they encountered fewer visible Native peoples around them, they came to perceive Indians as no longer an active threat to manifest destiny. Instead, they became a romantic relic from a bygone age, and a relic that the newcomers had improved, even as they believed that they had eradicated it. It was for this very same reason that locals like to say, Me-nah-sa-gor-ning. As Willis Ward, who purchased Apple Island in 1915, put it sometime before his death in 1944, numerous sails now dot and race over the lake in place of Indian canoes. It is the turn of a newer race to occupy this outdoor paradise, a sudden changeover occurring without jar or friction. Those words were published in 1946, the same year Ward's home on Apple Island was struck by lightning and burned. This excerpt is taken from his memoir, which begins with a reprint of all 30 stanzas of Leggett's poem. By the era of Tina Campbell's nephew, Campbell Harvey, Pontiacs Mound had multiplied. Whereas Tina Campbell described it as a standalone feature, Campbell Harvey cast it as part of a collection of 3 mounds, with 2 smaller ones just north. Most significantly, the mound's purpose had completely changed. And this is what he had to say about it. We islanders, at least, believed that Pontiac was buried there. Near it are the graves of his daughter and her fiancé. Believe it or not, I do. So in Campbell Harvey's retelling then, the stories of the star-crossed lovers and of Pontiac's heroic escapades, which used to be separate, were now fused. How did that happen? Well, among the hotel folk who visited with the extended Campbell family on Apple Island was Joseph Tar Copeland's nephew, Royal Samuel Copeland. Born in Dexter in 1868, educated in Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor, he went on to practice medicine at the University of Michigan and served as mayor of Ann Arbor before becoming a US Senator for New York. Campbell Harvey called Royal Copeland one of our guests. He had likely visited Apple Island as a child while his uncle still lived on the shore, but Royal Copeland also visited long after his uncle's hotel had closed, perhaps captivated by his childhood memories. And when he visited the island as an adult, the extended Campbell family recounted for him their native lore, including the story of the artifacts John Coates supposedly took back to Scotland. Royal Copeland listened to the tales, in Campbell Harvey's words, quote, skeptical, but as our guest, he was too much of a gentleman to willingly show any disbelief, but it was slightly evident. Well, sometime after his visit, Royal Copeland seems to have journeyed to Paisley. He claimed to have seen not just Apple Island relics, but relics taken from the grave of Pontiac. Whether to entertain his one-time hosts or himself, or to resuscitate the memory of his uncle's former hotel, in 1931, Royal Copeland published a story called Chief Pontiac Buried Here. The story begins in Illinois country, where Pontiac has just died. His local supporters set about defleshing the corpse and preparing the bones for transport back to Michigan for a fitting final resting place. As one historian has wryly noted, in Royal Copeland's tale, Pontiac's bones land not on the island, but on the northeast shore of Orchard Lake, where coincidentally Uncle Joseph's estate would one day stand. The bones are then taken across the water to the island, where 77 Indians, each working 77 pulse beats and throwing out 77 clods of earth to dig his grave. Then, in a truly inspired plot twist, Copeland restyles Leggett's grief-stricken fiancée into Pontiac's favorite daughter. Devastated by the loss of her father, in the course of paying her last respects to his bones, she falls down dead, dropping the silver cross that would find its way into the Paisley Museum into his open grave. Overcome by her sudden demise, her fiancé, handpicked by Pontiac himself, commits suicide, thrusting his razor-sharp scalping knife into his own heart. Thus, one grave becomes 3. Well, if this all sounds overly dramatic, you are right. These tales were ripe for performance by the very people who had encouraged their creation. In 1885, the Pontiac Gazette ran an article about the discovery of a skull unearthed under a wild plum tree on Apple Island. Tina Campbell's older brother, Forrest Campbell, capitalized on the story's sensationalism to stage a grand party for the whole countryside and relate as many legends as he could gather about Pontiac and Me-nah-sa-gor-ning. Stage being the operative word. The account of the party comes from Forrest Campbell's niece, Carrie Harvey, who you see on the lower right there. She was just shy of 17. On the Saturday evening of the party, guests from the surrounding community sailed, rowed, or paddled to Apple Island. The entertainment was set to occur on the high seat, the high ground on the island's north side, which afforded the best view of the opposite shore. But the guests were not led directly to the high seat. Instead, they were guided by paper lanterns along particular pathways, which all converged at Forrest Campbell's mother's house at the center of the island. And this traffic pattern was thoroughly intentional because it forced guests to use a single route from the house to the high seat, the thickly bordered, overgrown ghost walk. By starting the festivities along this eerie path, Forrest Campbell was setting the tone for the evening, even provoking nervousness in those who were superstitious about the Indians and ghosts. Once the sun had set and the guests were in their places, Forrest Campbell began the performance. He appeared on the scow, the island barge, which he had anchored across the lake close to the shore. As he rowed back towards the island, he gave a dramatic recitation of the lore. As Carrie Harvey put it, quote, "It was the home of Pontiac and the place of his burial, the finding of the cross in Pontiacs Mound, now in the Paisley Museum in Scotland, the finding of an Indian skull in wampum under the wild plum tree." As Forrest Campbell rode closer and closer to the guests, he continued the tales, quote, "The island had been an Indian burying ground, the hollow round excavations for the Indian corn, of the chief's council of war near the place where the boathouse now stands, how each year fewer and fewer chiefs came until only one came for several years alone, and then no more." Forrest Campbell's recitation of the facts was just a warm-up act designed to generate an atmosphere of interest in the Indians' activities on the island. This first physical and dramatic feat accomplished, he was ready for what Carrie Harvey called the great scene, his masterpiece, a dramatic reenactment of Me-nah-sa-gor-ning. But in Forrest Campbell's retelling, at least according to his niece's recollection, Me-nah-sa-gor-ning was not only the island, it was also the insane native woman herself. The island and the woman were one. As Forrest Campbell recited the haunting tale of Leggett's Me-nah-sa-gor-ning, he reached the moment when the murdered woman summons the zombie men to rise up and unearth the mystical canoe. Up to this point, the performance had been recitation only. But now, Forrest Campbell's guests were startled, some dismayed, even fearful, to see the events of the myth come terrifyingly to life. As Forrest recited the words, the listeners heard the sound of Me-nah-sa-gor-ning's drum summoning the dead tribe. They saw the reanimated corpses rise up and uncover the hidden canoe and paddle it. They watched the zombie men retrieve the dead fiance's body from the western woods and carry it across the lake to his former lodge on the shore, and then return the body to its burial place on the island. The crowd went wild, murmuring and gasping in great excitement, until Forrest assured them that the zombies were island boys and that the murdered fiance was Bob Lynn, Forrest Campbell's cousin. The performance concluded, the guests returned to Forrest and Tina Campbell's mother's home to dine on ice cream, cake, and lemonade, and they did so under the canopy of an apple tree. This location, too, must have been deliberate. The guests no doubt marveled to each other about the spectacle between mouthfuls. But Forrest Campbell had saved the most impressive display for last, a great bonfire lit on the island's north point, on top of which a long and big white boat had been thrown. The boat, Carrie Harvey noted, disappeared with ashes, but as it went out, the lake was so brilliantly lit that it made possible easy landings on many shores for the guests. The final act that recalled Leggett's mystical canoe, King Arthur's final journey to Avalon, and a Viking funeral, all in one. Forrest Campbell and his acting troupe may not have appreciated the irony of their performance, dressing up as the very people their way of life displaced, to reenact a poem supposedly about them that in fact had nothing to do with them. But the Campbells were keen to keep their stories going. In 1932, the year before he died, and 47 years after his big party, an aged Forrest Campbell was interviewed by the Pontiac Daily Press about Pontiac's burial place. Forrest Campbell proclaimed, "My family has always believed that Chief Pontiac was buried on this island. Where else could be such a fitting burial for a person of Pontiac's fame? Well, the journalist astutely noted, no one has ever been allowed to open up this big mound to see if the tales are true. Boris Campbell certainly did not want any newspaper subscribers to try it. To ward them off, the article was accompanied by a photo of Campbell sitting in his rocking chair, long rifle balanced on his knee. The subheadline proclaimed, Forrest S. Campbell guards huge Indian mound. Thank you.
Okay, let me unmute everybody. How do I do that, Katie?
Oh, I can do it for you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, unmute, there it is. Mute all, are we all unmuted?
So you can, there should be a button that says unmute all, which I'm happy
I'm
to.
unmuted now.
Okay. Well, cool. So we're all unmuted? I think we're all muted though.
They would have to do it themselves.
Yeah,
Okay.
all we can do is
Control
send a
themselves.
request to unmute, but they have to physically do it.
Well, of course, I forgot to say that we're open for questions now. My husband's over my shoulder, probably with questions. It's Rob Gregory, Island docent. Katie, you've shared so much somewhat familiar and somewhat very new information and images. And it's, well, it doesn't surprise me. It seems like this all makes much good sense and to me personally, and to hear this all put in perspective is great. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
And you've got to have used a lot of family photos, right, to put this all together?
Yes, although plenty from GWBHS's collections also. The deed has come from that, several things from the Glenn King collection there, and also the Forrest Campbell collections. So yeah, some good stuff from GWBHS too.
I wonder about all the artifacts.
So let's do one question at a time. And I was going to have one more question for you. Were you aware of this as a kid, that this was, more of the reality, or are there these things that you uncovered as a history major at U of M, or personally, or when did you become aware of all this?
Well, I certainly knew Me-nah-sa-gor-ning, Pontiac buried there with the Silver Cross. I mean, just like you all did. I certainly knew those stories. As my father likes to say, the only Pontiac over there is an old Pontiac car, not the man. But certainly over time, it has become clear, in bits and pieces that these community stories are just that, community stories. But until I actually sat down and looked at the sources and figured out how they all fit together, only then did I realize it was an advertising scheme. We all bought it. We all bought it, and it worked. So good job to Leggett and to Joseph Tar Copeland. We all bought it. Hook, line, and sinker.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, questions. Let's see, you can put them in the chat. I can look at those. Of course, nice work, says Neil and Charles.
Say your name.
And does anybody have some questions for Katie?
I do.
Okay.
Can you hear me? I'm Sue
Yes.
Dare.
Yes,
And
we can.
I am 85 years old, and I grew up in Huntington Woods. And we would come out here, and we were sure Pontiac was buried there. Isn't that funny? Now we live here in
Isn't that funny?
Bloomfield. It's marvelous, but stories like that intrigued us. Finally, in the 50s, I was able to drive, and we came out here. And there was actually, we could get on a boat ramp and just look across to the island, but nobody could go out there. Nobody could go out there. So I am just delighted that we could hear about this, even though it's too bad it was just a myth, which we figured that it was.
And worse is advertising.
The pride of the lake, which was the steamer that was ferrying hotel guests to Apple Island, was not around long. So that traffic pattern was very brief, but long enough to do the trick and get those stories out there and and in the community. So I'm delighted to hear your perspective.
I will jump in and say, even though our Apple Island trips won't be happening in June this year, last year we produced a virtual tour, and that's available on YouTube now anytime. So that's what it's titled as. So check that out. And from Sue Williams, we have a question which says, what do you attribute the R in the name?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question, Sue. Yes, I mean, certainly it is a mangling of whatever the original Anishinaabe-Moin name is. It's probably a function of A, not being able to pronounce the syllables properly, B, so far removed from the people who were calling it by that name. It's, you know, it's a memory, it's an attempt to remember the syllables and how they sounded. So I think your guess about the R is as good as anybody's.
Gina, I've got a quick question if it's appropriate now.
Sure. Hi, this is Mike McGinnis, Executive Director of the Oakland History Center, also known as the home of Oakland County Pioneer and Historical Society. Hi, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you. And great work, Katie, the Greater West Bloomfield Historical Society, and thanks for West Bloomfield Parks for sponsoring it. My question is, have you come across anything that might be even more tangentially unrelated in your research, where they were trying to very speciously connect something with Pontiac and the city proper or the village, add some mythology to try and grasp at straws and claim some of that legacy or that, fame by association?
That's a great question. And it certainly is possible that is out there. Certainly S.B. McCracken, as the editor of the Pontiac paper, very well may have been trying to do that by virtue of where he lived and what his job was. But mostly these were stories that were told by people who had no connection to Pontiac except they went there to pick up the mail. Otherwise, they were in Detroit. So from their perspective, there was no need or interest in doing it. But that's not to say that there might not be some other attempts out there to connect it specifically to the city. As I say, I have never seen an explanation for how the land surveyors arrived at the name Pontiac. And maybe there's a lovely source out there that would shed some more light on that and make the kind of connection that you're looking for, Mike.
Your hypothesis is very well founded, and we've heard similar interpretations along those lines. I mean, the gentlemen in the Pontiac Company, their businesses were burned in Detroit in the War of 1812. These are people that, had a visceral hatred. It's in the years after they burned in the United States Capitol, they're burning, there's just a lot of raw emotion. So anyway, to give a middle finger to the British, enemy, it ties into the mythology of quote unquote Indian country. There's all these different layers, but no, there is an original. We have not seen anything that explicitly says, this is why. So it's very, again, them trying to cast a wide net. But I've heard some reference to it being such a common, like almost like this catch-all name or reference, where Pontiac being the most infamous of indigenous peoples in that era, that it's almost like the default name that they went with because it's like almost like a household name. I don't know if you've come across anything that researching Apple Island and this mythology that kind of reinforced that.
His name.
No, I have not. That's another good point. I have not. But yeah, if you're going to try to tie an island to a high profile indigenous person, there isn't anybody higher profile that was still in public memory by 1818 than Pontiac. It certainly could have been Blue Jacket. I mean, there were lots of other very high profile people in the 18th century, but by the 19th century, it was all about Pontiac. And I think in large part because, as you say, he also went up against the British, and technically he didn't lose. It was a stalemate at the fort. He was forced to sign a peace treaty several years later, but he didn't actually lose. So that's a pretty remarkable thing to stake your new county seat on.
Here's a question from Tim Paul. Have there been any Indian burial mounds identified in the area around Orchard Lake?
Not that I am aware of, but I will defer to others in the audience who may know more than I. I mean, we find references on maps, for example, of supposedly where native graves were discovered, but not that I've ever heard confirmed. Just notations on maps is all I know of.
And we know from maps that Indian huts were on the north shore of Orchard Lake, on the, I want to say, south of Commerce by Indian Trail. That's where I think of it as my mind. And then also at Walled Lake area.
Downtown too.
Yeah, and Neil notes Tecumseh. Yes, that is certainly true. Certainly true. Tecumseh was at Detroit and had a spectacular trick that he played on the British and got Hull to surrender the fort. So they certainly could have gone with Tecumseh. That is a fair point.
That would be good to know about. Good.
So if Isla Schoenberg has a question, can she unmute? Hi, go ahead, please.
I am unmuted.
All right.
It's more of a comment than a question. I want to thank you. But years ago, when we were learning about Apple Island and living in West Bloomfield, we also had a wedding in St. Louis and Cahokia. And we were very confused at the time to see Pontiac buried where we went to this wedding. And And it was interesting that you mentioned that, because I don't know if everyone's aware, because we certainly weren't until we went to Cahokia, that Cahokia about 1,000 years ago ran the whole of North America. And it makes sense that Pontiac would have gone looking for help to Cahokia. And the mound at Cahokia, though, during most of my lifetime was a outdoor movie theater, until they realized that there really were people that were sacrificed and buried in that mound there. So it might interest you just to extend your research to Cahokia too. It was a fascinating place.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so that was certainly the population center up till about 1500 for North America. And certainly makes sense that he would have gone there, because there were still so many native peoples there in the 18th century. But the other reason that he was in southwestern Illinois so much was because at Fort de Chartres, which is a French era fort, been taken over by the British, the commandant, was still the same Frenchman that had been in power before the changeover in 1763. So Pontiac kept going there with the hope that he was going to convince this guy, this last Frenchman who was in power in this British fort, to say, yes, I will support your cause. Let's get the French back in here. Let's kick the British out. And so he kept going back and back and back. And finally, this man said, it's not going to happen. Look, the French are not coming back. They're not interested in coming back. And that was the moment that Pontiac realized he had no cause anymore. And that's really what precipitated his signing the peace treaty at Oswego. So many reasons to be in southwestern Illinois over Apple Island. Yeah, thank you.
I can chime in that Rob and I have been to Cahokia. We just bumped into it, and indeed it's a very interesting place to go, with the mounds still there, as well as an excellent museum. It just was fascinating.
I've never seen him.
So it's outside of St. Louis, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
On the Illinois side, the East St. Louis.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions?
I'm watching out for those reanimated corpses coming up when we sleep out there.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Katie, for putting this in perspective. And to me, it fits so well with our modern times, where we're looking for better understandings of true connections between people and wanting to look at things carefully and
Huh?
see reality for what it is. And it is, as one person said, it's more fascinating, but
You don't have a rim on them,
it's good to see.
much nicer than mine.
My pleasure. I would, you know, I was mulling over the question about Tecumseh. I would bet you that the reason that the land speculators went with Pontiac over Tecumseh was that Tecumseh was not local. He was Shawnee. He he moved around, but mostly Indiana and southern Indiana. So he certainly came to Detroit. He played this marvelous trick on the British there, where he had a very limited number of men with him to attack the fort, both native and British, and he ended parading them in a circle around the fort. So it looked like he had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men, but he didn't. He only had a few. But General Hull freaked out, saw what he thought was this enormous force, and then without a moment of bloodshed, like there was no stand, no nothing, he surrendered the fort. So and he was court-martialed eventually for it. But I think the reason is that Tecumseh was not local. Pontiac was local. He was born along the Detroit River somewhere, and lived near the fort. Whereas Tecumseh was an out-of-stater. So I would suspect that's why they went with somebody like Pontiac over someone like Tecumseh. But again, all speculative.
One question from Christopher Warner is the Orchard Lake Hotel a historical building with tours? I can tell you it has a historical marker outside that GWBHS helped Orchard Lake St. Mary's School put up, but we don't include that on our tours as such. You can stop on that campus anytime, you know, it's a public place, so you can just park and walk in there and walk around. It's a great trip down memory lane to be in such a space with such old buildings.
It's a nice campus.
Aren't there Indian mounds in Grand Rapids? Well, I can answer they're all around. When you go to Fort Wayne in Detroit, there's a short mound that has a chain link fence around it. What else, Katie? Are there any in Grand Rapids?
Yeah, there are. They are all over the place. There's one in Pleasant Ridge. Yes.
Really?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yep. Indian Mound Road. Yeah.
Well,
Oh, Mound Road.
So
Well,
makes
they're
sense.
all around.
how about Mound Road? Wonder where
Yep,
that street got its
exactly.
name.
Exactly. Yeah, there are lots of mound and Indian mound roads which refer to those mound builders
Wow.
structures.
Now, Katie, I don't know if you mentioned it, but can we assume that Pontiac was on the island for meetings, if anything? I mean, if it was a meeting place, wouldn't he have gone there? He's a big kahuna.
I mean, so after he left Detroit in 1763, after the siege was over, he was trying to round up people to his cause. So he was moving village to village. So it's certainly possible that he might have passed through, stopped there briefly, but he certainly wasn't living there. If you look at his migration patterns, it would not make sense for him to have been at Apple Island for long. Passed through maybe.
Okay.
But, you know, David Brose, the archaeologist, is certain that he's found an encampment on Apple Island dating roughly to the 1750s or 60s. So, you know, his point is maybe there were some Pontiac supporters, if not Pontiac himself, on the island ready to help support the siege against the fort. So it's possible.
Okay.
How often are mounds excavated? I think that all
Oh, they
depends.
aren't.
Yeah.
They aren't. It used to be 100 years ago. They were. Sorry, I'm getting terrible feedback on my end.
I know.
It used to be 100 years ago that they were. The Okmulgee mounds in Macon, Georgia, for example, had a train track lasted right through them, and so that obliterated half of the mound. But now they're protected sites, and rightly so. So there is no excavation, no nothing.
Why is it right? So
Right.
Okay, good. All right, so what time is it? I don't have.
Questions about,
3.
how do I mute?
Good.
Question about past information from Apple Island tours.
You hear me?
I don't know. Does somebody have a question?
Yeah, it's me. I don't know whether you can hear me or not. Can you hear
It's
me?
very fuzzy, yes.
This is Mike Brogan, and I used to be a member. I live in Bloomfield Hills now. I just, if you can hear me, I just wanted to comment that I've been on several of the Apple Island tours, and some of the information that the docents provided was very, very different from what I heard in this presentation. Specifically, they referenced the fact that the tribal customs when a great chief died was not to bury the body in one place, but to cut it up into many pieces and bury it in a number of different places that they were known to frequent during their lifetime. So their understanding was that at least part of Chief Pontiac's body was very likely buried on Apple Island because he went there. They also said that Apple Island was a birthing place for his tribe's women. Evidently, he was quite the ladies' man, and he had affairs with a number of the women in his tribes and a number of children born, and he would often go to Apple Island to be there when the births took place. So this is the information that I've received in previous tours, and I was just wondering how that jives with what, you know, your research. And you didn't mention anything about these traditions.
I have not heard the birthing place story at all. I can tell you that Pontiac has one known descendant. He had one son that we know of and two wives, and that's it. So so I'm not sure where that story has come from. I certainly have not heard it. As far as the burial customs, you know, the thing about Pontiac's murder in 1769 was that it had the potential to set off a huge diplomatic crisis. So as soon as the commander outside of Cahokia realized that that Pontiac had been killed, Pontiac was walking out of a store at that moment, and an Illinois man, a Peoria Indian, came over and killed him. And so it had the potential to set off this diplomatic crisis. And so the commander ordered Pontiac to be buried immediately. So he was out of there and removed and buried instantly to try to let things simmer down a bit. So I think the likelihood of their having gone back, you know, after that burial and done any kind of desecration to the body and moved some pieces around seems highly unlikely to me. I will also say I have never heard anything about there being pieces of Pontiac on the island. It's, you know, it's all or nothing. So I think we can be pretty confident that he's in St. Louis under a parking lot, which is where the marker is in St. Louis. I think we can be pretty confident about that.
So the stories that the docents were telling us was basically the best information that they had at the time, but it was probably, as you suggested, based on mythology, that they weren't aware that it was a mythology. Okay.
Yes, I would say that seems perfectly plausible.
Okay.
The reference to, sure, and to follow up with that, the reference to the birthing, that what I hear still today is from Mike Jewell, is that islands are special places and birthing is special. And so that to go to the island to give birth would be a safe place, and there's overtones of sacredness of an island and of the process of birth. And that they're both the same, and the native indigenous people look at an island as
An act of birth.
An act of birth of the earth, so that it would be very symbolic for them, I think, to give birth on an island. So people would come to it for those special purposes, is what we hear. And again, we just always use the information we have, and we've hesitated to talk about the myths because they seem so convoluted and too fantastical to be true. So we've just said nothing, and appreciate Katie clearing up the air and lending a lot more to it.
Yeah, this is quite a few mouthfuls in this delivery.
Yeah.
And a lot of information to work with.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll wind it up here. thank you all for coming. We enjoyed it. And thank you, Katie, for clearing up the air and
Yep,
giving
adding
us
to our knowledge.
Yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for a
Thank you.
wonderful program.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome. Support our organization. We would appreciate that too. There's no charge for today, but donations and memberships are only $20. So be a member and support our local history. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Go on.